Hello, my name is Miguel Ortega. I'm a visual effects artist and director. For the past 15 years, I've worked as a visual effects artist focusing primarily on creature modeling and texturing. I graduated from Noman School of Visual Effects. After that, I worked at Luma Pictures, Rhythm and Hues, Lightstorm Entertainment, Cafe Effects, Phil Tippett Studios, and Digital Domain. While I was working for Phil Tippett, I bought a digital camera, the Red One, and I started working on my first short film called The Green Ruby Pumpkin. That film got the attention of a lot of studios and producers. However, I needed to show that I could do dialogue and work with actors, so I did a 30-minute film with my partner Tran Ma called The Niño. The Niño was shot almost entirely in our living room, and the majority of the visual effects were done by us two and a small group of friends. The Niño won over 35 film festivals and got us representation with CAA, who is the most powerful talent agency in the world. Within 2 months of that, we optioned the rights to turn this into a feature film, still keeping the director title. The movie's currently in the final stages of the script writing and will become a feature film shortly. Since my focus was modeling and texturing, a lot of the stuff that we're going to cover today is stuff that I learned as I went along. I was not trained in Nuke, I was trained to be a modeler, which is ironic since we're probably not going to cover any of modeling and texturing in this project. So I'm going to focus on Nuke, look development, lighting, and just basic concepts that I try to apply on all the projects that I work on. I hope you guys get something out of this, and if I could help at all, just message me and I'll do what I can. Okay, thank you.
All right, so multipass rendering. So for this scene, I just wanted to simplify it and just use a few balls with different shaders. So let's go and start plugging these in. So lighting, GI, reflection, refraction, specular. We're going to go add our Z depth, and we'll also add self-illumination and subsurface scattering. So we'll go into our Z depth, and in terms of the depth white, the way I approach this is I always select the furthest object, in this case this guy, and you can see him on the top right, the distance from camera is set to 13.11. So I figure if the furthest object I care about is 13, I'll set the depth white to something like 30, so everything past that point would fall to just white. So you could kind of see that ball there is 13. Right behind that, it basically falls to white. So that's perfect. We'll set the sampler type to bucket, and we'll adjust our threshold, our max subdivs, and our minimum shading rate, and we'll do a high quality render. And we'll save that out as an EXR file. And inside of Nuke, we're gonna use the shuffle node to start separating all the passes. So you can see we'll set what pass on the left side, and on the right side what we want to turn that into. So in this case, lighting turns into RGB A or RGB. You have to set it to RGB or else it'll inherit the alpha. It'll turn the luminance into an alpha. So we'll just do lighting to RGB, and you can see I'm naming my shuffle nodes just for organization's sake, but you don't have to do that. So now we have our GI. You can see I'm merging them using a plus. So we'll do our subsurface now. We'll add another merge node to this as well. We always put B on the previous nodes. We'll set the blend mode to plus. We'll add another shuffle. Oops, plug it up there. Set this to reflection. We'll just name it. We'll use a plus node. We'll do one more. So here's our refraction. We'll plus this as well. So all of them will be plus. Let's call this refraction. Let's do self-illumination. And again, it's plus. So now if we compare, oh, let me name this real quick. I named the wrong node, so let's just set this to merge self-illumination. Okay, so that looks good. So now if we compare the beginning to the end, you can see that they should look the same. One is missing, which is my specular. So let's plug that in. And now let's compare it. And you can see they are both identical. So that's good. So you can see I could go in now and lower the intensity of the refraction, lower the intensity of the specular. All of a sudden there's no reflectivity. So we have that much more control. We could make it even more reflective. We could kill the subsurface. And you can see our alpha is correct. If you would have set this to the default RGBA, your alpha at the end would look like this, which is problematic. So just by making sure one of them is set to RGB, it'll propagate the proper alpha all the way down the pipeline. Okay. Now I want to create multi-mats as well. A lot of people are using crypto mat, but for this I'm just going to use the old school multi-mat, and you could see I'm just putting red, green, and blue to 1, 2, 3, then 4, 5, 6. I'm making sure I have use material IDs and consider for anti-aliasing turned on. So now if I go to each individual shader, I'm going to turn on material ID and I'll assign a number. In this case, number 1. And this guy here, number 2. This guy over here, we'll go to the shader, attributes, material ID. He'll be number 3. This guy over here will be number 4. And the ground will make number 5. So those numbers are connected to the numbers we punched in our multi-mat. So you can see when I render them and I look at the multi-mat pass, whatever I assign number 1 will be red, whatever is number 2 is green, whatever is 3 is blue. And those numbers can be whatever number. They could be 664, 665, 666. They could be whatever you want as long as they're matching. As long as the shader has the number and the multi-matte red, green, or blue input have that same number, it'll work. So now you can see here I could shuffle out. I'll go to multi-matte. You can see we have all our red, our green, and our blue, and I'll only select the red channel, and I'll set this to be alpha or RGB alpha. You could leave either or. But you can see now it's only showing me that one object. And let's say I were to go to my reflection and I wanted to kill off just the red ball, I could add, just wipe it out like that. You can see it's affecting all of them. But if I add a grade node, for example, and I set the multiply to 0, and I use the mask and plug it into that shuffle node that has the multi-mask, you can see how it wiped it out there, and now that I switched to green, it wiped it off the second ball. If you'd have done it with blue, it would have wiped off the third ball. So this allows you to isolate individual objects and control the specular reflections, even do subtle color corrections. You could do all kinds of stuff. So it's extremely powerful. Here we could add a clone, so as we're adjusting one of them, it's bringing down our specularity and our reflection on just the red object. Alright, so let's get this barnacle and populate it over the rock. But before we do that, let's try to do it just on the simple plane, just to get a few concepts out of the way. So we'll just jump into FX mode. We'll go to the Create Mesh Network. You could choose Instancer or Mesh. For now, I'm just going to use Instancer. Later down, we might use Mesh. So I'll also open my Mesh editor, so it allows me to quickly jump between attributes here. And you can see when I increase the number of points, right now I currently have it set to 10. It replicates the barnacle 10 times. At the moment, there's no connection between the barnacle and the polyplane. So you can see it's clearly going off the surface. Let's go into the number of points and set it to 300. And you can see 300 points equals 300 barnacles, of course. So now we have a long line of barnacles. And I'm going to set the distribution type to mesh. And under input mesh, I need to plug in the polyplane. And I'll just middle mouse drag it into there, and immediately it populates across the surface. Or actually, what it uses is the word scatter. Now, I'm going to go in here. You can see there's still history connected to this, and I'm going to start adding more geometry on the surface of the plane. And as it does that, if you notice, it's adding more barnacles to that area. That's not unlike certain settings in hair modules where if there's more vertices, it applies more either hair follicles, or in this case, it's applying more. So by turning on the scatter use face area, it evenly distributes it across the surface, which is what we want. Okay. I'm gonna go in here, and I want to show you guys how I create masks to control what areas have barnacles and not. So I'm going to just throw in create a throwaway shader, in this case just a surface shader, and I'm going to go to the 3D paint tool. I flooded it black and I'm set the color to white, and I'm just going to draw an X, and I'll create a few little points here and there. I've sometimes had issues with it with Surface Shader, and if you do have that issue, just use a Lambert. It's easy enough, but this does not work with the V-Ray shader, so make sure you use one of the primitives. You have to save your project so it knows where to store the texture that you create. So just make sure you do that. So I saved out the texture. I'm going to create an add visibility node, and I'm going to go into my hypershade into my textures. And you can see that it has created a file texture there, and I'm going to plug that into the strength map. Now, one thing that's very important, and we're going to talk about this later, is by using a plane, it's going to apply extremely easily. But we're going to have to do a few extra steps once that geometry is more complex than just a plane. We'll get to that later. But you can see now the barnacles are only appearing in specific areas. Okay, and you could increase the number of points or decrease it, but it's only going to populate those areas. Now, if I were to create a sphere, and let's just delete the visibility node, let's select the distribution node and just replace the plane with the sphere, instantly all those barnacles now populate that sphere. So it's extremely simple to replace geometry. As long as you swap them in the distribute node, it'll propagate to whatever you want. Okay, you can see some of them are rotating the wrong way, so I'll just bring up the rotation ramp on the left side. I'll bring down the scale to have more variation in size, and these values can go beyond 1. So even though that's just going to 1, you could put 1.4, and you could see that the barnacles are much bigger. Some of them are interpenetrating, but it's okay because we're gonna see it at such a distance you're not even gonna notice, and actually might add to the complexity. Okay. So let's just create a light. Let's just do a quick IPR and see what that looks like. It looks pretty cool. Adds a lot of complexity, a lot of breakup. So you could have used a normal map for this and sculpted all this in ZBrush or Mudbox, but you would never get that level of complexity. So going back to the rock, let's just come over here, create mesh network. I'm going to set this to mesh this time instead of instancer. I'm going to select mesh as the distribution type, drag cliff top, give it a second. We'll increase the number of points to something like 3,000. Give it a second, it's going to take a minute. It's a lot of geometry, and that geometry will be mesh1 underscore repro mesh. And you can see that it's now scattered across. We're going to turn on scatter use face area so we don't get more geometry in the crevices where there might be more geo. So it'll be evenly distributed. We'll turn off ignore ramps, come down to our actual ramps, and play with the rotation and the scale. Now, it's probably not a bad idea to go in here and lower the amount of points while you do your rotations and your scale. So right now, by bringing both of those up, the rotations will be correct. And we'll play with the scale, bring it up to 5 as the maximum. You can see it's way beyond 1. We could go back to the repro mesh. You can see all the barnacles look nice, still not enough. We'll bring the scale up to 8. This is another reason why it's better to use normal maps over displacement maps. If this were displaced and you're scaling the model up to 8, it would not look correct because the displacement maps are very dependent on the scale of the model. So let's go up and increase the number of points drastically. So we'll go to 20,000. So there you see we have a lot more. You can see we're already starting to have graphics card issues because of the amount of geo. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm recording this, which is taking up a lot of the GPU. So we could add a visibility node, and here I'll just jump into Mudbox real quick. I'll spare you the process, but you could see that I focused certain areas to have the barnacles, so the 20,000 barnacles would only be in specific areas. You can see when it's applied, it does not look right. This is what I was trying to say earlier with the polyplane. So for starters, let's set this to raw. Okay, we have to go into our projection type, our map projection axes, and set it to UV, and then relink the cliff into the visibility node. This doesn't really make much sense to me, but it is what it is. And now you can see that the barnacles are only appearing in the front facing planes that were painted out or painted in Mudbox. We'll bring this up to 30,000. Okay. Let's set our shading to use default shader so that we see everything gray shaded. And I increased the scale bringing it up to 12 because I really want it to be visible. Okay, so that looks much better. I'm selecting the model. So again, that's Mesh 1 Repro Mesh. And I'll go to Create V-Ray, Create Proxy. And I'll just name this so ArcStation Barnacle A. I'll create the proxy. Okay, I'll go back to the distribute node. I'll go to the random seed and just really you could type in any number and it's going to change the position of every single one of those barnacles. Go to Create V-Ray, Create Proxy, and export out a different one. So now that would be two separate proxy models that we've exported. So this one we'll call Barnacle B, create proxy. I'm speeding through this. It actually takes a little bit longer than it appears. We'll change the random seed. Let's set this to 7. It changes the position of all of them, and we'll export this again. Let's name this Barnacle C. Now we'll go to our distribute node, and under number of points, I'll set this to 1. So you can see there's just one model there. We'll go to import proxy, and we'll start loading in number 1. Now a proxy mesh will not show you full resolution. It just shows little random poly faces. We'll bring in a third. Create. So from this distance it looks like those are the barnacles, but you can see when we get close up, it's just random scattered faces. We'll select those 3 meshes and apply the existing barnacle shader on it, which we haven't really done anything to, but we'll just connect it anyhow. And if we render this right now, you can see there's thousands and thousands of barnacles all over the surface. Since we've created the proxy though, we don't have to carry, 100,000 barnacles inside of our Maya file. It is referencing that V-Ray proxy file. So I'll just go in here, lower the reflection amount. Again, underwater, less reflection. And we could fine-tune this later, but for now, that looks okay. So let's go into Maya software. And let's just take a look at these 3 cubes. Something I use often, and people just don't seem to use it at all anymore, is Maya software to do certain extremely art-directed fog effects. So if I create a spotlight, let's scale it up. The scale actually matters here. And let's angle it a bit. And we'll create 2 of them. Okay. So we'll set this guy's color to red and this guy's color to green. And that was done intentionally. Let's go, and you can see we went into our light fog option. You can see it creates this blue cone emitting out of you can see it creates a blue cone emitting out of the spotlight. If I were to render that now, you can see we would get something like this. What's great about that is if I go into my red channel, I will only see one of the lights. If I go into my green channel, I will only see the other light. So it's an extremely powerful way of isolating one effect versus the other. So you can see that the fog just stops in the exact same position that the blue cones are stopping. I'm going to go in and turn on use depth map shadows. So I'm going to turn off ray trace shadows and turn use depth map shadows. And now when I render that, the floor will stop the light from continuing, and we get something like this. So I could go in and play with the drop-off. Drop-off does not seem to like the IPR mode, so some of those settings we are going to have to re-render to get a final look. Okay, so we'll select one of the lights. We'll go to fog shadow intensity and bring it up to like 3. And this will make the shadows that are being cast into the fog much stronger. So much more dramatic. We could go into 3D textures and plug in a 3D cloud. And you can see that there's a 3D placement node here. We can scale this up until we get this really nice broken up atmospheric quality. Select our second 2D placement node, scale it up. Okay, so I brought in that render, and you can see I just shuffle out only the green or only the red and put it back into RGB. So it's a way of me isolating just one of the channels. You can see that's my red channel, and the one above was my green, which is the light coming from above. So extremely powerful way of isolating light sources in your comp. Just render a red light, a green light, and a blue light, and you'll have 3 different variations with one single render. So we're just going to go in and adjust the multiply every few frames just to give it more of a flickering light bulb effect. I don't want to go in and do it on 155 frames, so I'll go into loop and I'll select the first and last frame of my loop, and now just adjust them and get this to feel like a more loopable curve. So something like that. Maybe that's too perfect, but the point is, go in there and keep messing with it all you want, but you get the idea. So here we'll add another grade node. This is something, again, from the diving shot, particulate. Let's scale it down. Place it in the beam of light. And we'll set the masking back to that. So we have two different particulate layers that'll only be illuminated where the light beam is. Okay, so we're going to just adjust our saturation and our contrast. So you start adding more and more fog elements, your image does start losing contrast. So at a certain point you do have to go in and rebalance stuff. So here's our foreground element. We'll scale it. So if you remember what I said during the underwater shot, I always want 3 layers of depth: a foreground, a midground, and a background. The foreground element is irrelevant to me. I mean, I do want it to look good, but it's more about just getting a sense of depth. I'm usually going to make it go out of focus anyway. It isn't necessarily something I want the users to see or to pay attention to. I just want them to feel that they're in the crowd there, or they're inside of a cave, or they're in the bushes watching. I want them to always feel like they're in there. They're voyeurs looking into this movie, and it just frames the image nicer. So here you can see we have our roto. We're having some keying issues on the right hand side. Instead of spending too much time trying to figure out what that is in my key light, I'll just throw in a quick roto and just get rid of that. So we'll clean up the edge with our in mask. So you can see the wood line now looks perfect. You're not getting the bounce green in the reflection. And we'll roto out the corner. So we have our garbage mat. And we'll create another one. You could use less roto nodes, but I like to have everything separated. That's just my way, but you could do it however you want. So you could see, as I mentioned earlier, you probably won't even notice that the guys in the midground left look too similar to the ones in the midground right, because there's going to be something in the foreground blocking them, and I was right. So we'll grade them. We'll go to our light wrap. We talked about light wrap on the diver, just wrapping the light of the background. This will be very subtle. So I'm just going to crop out that part. It was popping out too much. I didn't want the book. It was creating a tangent with my actor. See? And Let's make sure we don't have animation on the rotor. So we'll do a defocus. Bring that up to about 20. So you can see they're out of focus. The only thing I care about in the foreground is that the audience feels that they are whispering to each other. That's it. So we'll write this all out. And one thing I'll do here is I'll render it out. You can see I rendered it out at 2560 by 1080, much larger than my 1920 by 810. I'll create a constant at 1920 by 1080, sorry, 1920 by 810, and then I will scale my render, which was done at 25 something by whatever, and I'm going to just scale that render up or down to give a very, very, very slight push in or push out. In this case, it'll be a very slight push in. So it's like scaling from, let's say, 75% to 75.5%. And it only works if you make it very slight. If you do it too much, it's going to be very clear that you're not doing any parallax, which will look fake. Here we're adding a node that I like called AK Romanticism. It's essentially a chromatic aberration node. This could very easily be overdone. It is also softening stuff because it's misaligning the channels. So use it, be very subtle with it. The last thing is a plugin I absolutely worship called Film Convert Pro. And here we could convert to what sort of film stock, whether it's 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter. I love this plugin. If I had to keep one plugin, this would be the one I would keep over everything. I just really love it. And I have it in Nuke, which I use just to preview stuff, but I never do my final comps with this baked in. I always do this in Premiere so that I could apply it across multiple shots. So anyway, that's it. Thank you guys for listening to this. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you got something from this. I encourage you to see the Nino. Whether you like it or not, that's fine if you don't, but just at least I hope you see the amount of work that was put into getting this done, especially when you keep in mind that the majority of the work was done with a tiny group of people in their living room. So if you guys get anything from this, I hope it's the fact that if you want to do a film, go out and do it. If you're a modeler, try to learn more than just ZBrush, more than just Maya. Try to learn as much as you can. Learn Nuke. Nuke can make you a better artist. It could make you work less inside of 3D. And at the end of the day, nobody cares how you got it done. The only thing that matters is if the illusion worked or not. So thanks again. Feel free to write to me on social media, on Facebook and Instagram. I'm pretty good with replying. Thanks again. Bye-bye. So next up is the ground plane. So for this we'll use Quixel Mixer. We'll use a 4x4 meter plane, and we'll add a surface layer. We have a large library already, and we'll go to stones, stones on soil. So you can see it's very clear that it's a tileable texture. So the key is to add as many layers as possible to make it not feel like it's a tileable texture. If we click on the top left, you can see that it shows you a larger tile. But always keep in mind what the camera angle is going to be. Sure, it looks tileable if you look at it from above, from God POV, but that's not what we're going to be looking at it from. We'll add a noise, and that alone just breaks up the surface nicely. We could play with the amplitude and the frequency. You could see that starts looking a little bit better. Bring the octaves up. That makes a really big difference. Bring up the persistence. And if we overcrank this, just for the hell of it, we could see what it's doing. So let's bring that back down. So let's go in and add another surface layer. We'll add a soil. So you can see, you could still see the underlying stones on soil peeping through. And we could play with the settings, either blend from above or blend from below, so you get a different effect. And we could also play with the threshold. So you can see it tiling. So we'll play with the threshold a bit to reveal a little bit more of the stone below. Okay, so it starts looking a little bit more organic. The soil clay is definitely too mustardy, so we'll fix that later. When you bring up the wrap to base, it doesn't completely override the underlying displacement. So it's good to play around with that a little bit. We could play with the high frequency slider, get a little bit more detail in there. Let's see it tiled. We're only going to see a small section of this. We'll never know it's tileable. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. We'll go into our reflectance diffuse, desaturate it a bit, darken it as well. Press apply. So under repetitions, I'm going to double that up to 8. And you can see it's giving us a warning below that says scaled to 50% of the correct size. So basically it's telling us, hey, you're scaling this to an inappropriate size, but it's okay. I don't care what that says. If it looks good, it is good. I'm also going to set the HDRI to be more overcast, because ultimately we're not going to have a lot of reflection anyway. So I want to see what it looks like flatter. I'll also go in and I'll throw in an atlas layer to give me some more seashells. So you can see the seashells are there. They look very bright. So we'll go into our diffuse and darken those guys up. We could sample color. That looks better. and I'll go to export. Initially, I'm going to export it as 4096 by 4096. I have a feeling we're going to come back to this and I'll export it at a higher resolution later. So we'll export this out. If you scroll down, you could see that everything is being saved in an 8-bit format except for our displacement, which is a 32-bit EXR. So it's exporting a total of 6 maps. Back in Maya, we have our plane. I already plopped in a light. We'll go in real quick and throw in all our different maps, so our diffuse, our spec, our gloss, etc. I won't bore you through this. You can see we're just trying to dial down the UV repetition. Okay, we got to make sure that they're all using the same 2D placement node. That way we adjust one of them and it propagates across all of the different textures that are connected to this ground shader. So let's just plug in our 2D placement nodes. Let's delete the unused 2D placement nodes. Keep everything nice and organized. Let's name our shader. And now let's go in and go to Create V-Ray, V-Ray Displacement. Apply single V-Ray displacement node to selection. We'll add a file texture. So let's load that up. Let's go to Attributes, V-Ray, Allow Negative Colors. Alpha is luminance. Let's go to Attributes, V-Ray, Displacement Controls. And we'll bring up the displacement amount if we want to. Let's do a test first with 1. Before we do that though, let's make sure that it's using the same 2D placement node so the displacements and the color line up. Let's do a quick IPR. So that looks good, but I think the bump map looks a little crunchy, the normal map, so we'll set that to a very low number just to make sure we know what we're looking at. Are we seeing the displacement or too much normal map? We'll rotate around and take a look. Remember, we're gonna see it pretty close up, so it doesn't matter if it looks tileable. We'll set the bump map to 0. I just want to make sure I'm seeing the displacement first, and then I could dial that back up. Back in Quixel, I'll go in and I'll darken the sand a little bit. I wasn't a big fan of the previous one, so we'll just replace that. I've loaded up a brown ramp and a noise texture. It's just regular noise, regular ramp. You can see there's nothing special about it. And noise, I always use the Perlin noise. It's the one I'm used to using. We could just play with those settings, and I want to use these to blend and adjust the values of my color map. So I'll load 3 textures. I'll put the ramp in the bottommost layer. I'll put my diffuse map in the middle, and then in the top I'll put the noise layer. And I could set that to multiply. So if we check that now, oh, I forgot to plug it in, I think, yes. You're gonna see it looks extremely strong. It looks way too strong, too much contrast on the blacks. So we'll go in there and lower that. That looks better. Maybe a little less. It's too little. That's looking better. Now I could go to that, my actual texture map from Quixel and lower the opacity a bit, just to have a little bit more brown peeping through it. And that looks much better. So I'll throw in, just a throwaway Lambert texture. I'll go to my 3D painting tools. I'll assign a color map. 2K is fine. And I will flood this with black. And then just go in and paint a bunch of white splotches. This is where I want my grass to be. So I'm getting some weird playback issues because Camtasia is recording the screen, but you get the idea. We'll save those textures out. We'll go back to our original shader and then go to Create V-Ray, V-Ray Fur, add V-Ray Fur to selection. Here we could preview the fur, turn it on and off, and everything below it is actually in the render settings, or would affect the render settings, I mean. We could play with the bend, the taper, the gravity. And I'm going to drag the map I just created into the density texture of the fur. So now you can see the grass is only there. In terms of the distribution, I'm going to bring up per face to 400. And I'll just create a brown shader. I don't want this to look like very vibrant grass. I just want it to look like some stuff in the bottom. It could be some weird fibery stuff. Who knows what it is. It's just to give it some complexity. So we'll go in and adjust the length variance, the gravity variance, the direction variance, just to get more complexity. And we'll bring up the reflection just a bit so it doesn't look so dead. I probably won't even notice it, but just in case. Okay, so let's populate the floor with some pebbles. So we'll select, first let's actually scale down these rocks a little bit. I want to make sure they're sitting right on the ground plane. They could be interpenetrating a little, that's okay. And we'll freeze, transform, reset transformation. Make sure everything is set to 000. We'll go to mesh, create mesh network, mesh, and there we go. We'll have 10 copies. Now I'll select these other rocks and I'll drag them into the mesh repro node, and then I'll go into the ID, and you can see that it says ID count 5. So that means that it could randomize between these 5 pebbles so they don't all look the same. Okay, we'll set the distribution type to mesh, drag the polyplane, and you could see it's scattered. There's just not enough rocks. So we'll bring the number of points up to 300. You can see that looks much better. We'll turn off ignore ramps. Adjust the rotation. Let's bring up the scale a bit so the smallest ones are not so small. We'll bring this up a bit more. As you can see, as I fumble through this, it's why you would want to have your mesh editor. It's just easier to access. So we brought the amount of rocks up substantially, and when we press render, we get that. So we'll just go in and throw in a texture. These are so small that we could just move through this pretty quickly. So as I bring down the amount, it's just to darken it a bit. We'll bring up the amount to 5,000. Let's go to 15,000. That looks better. Since we have so many, let's make the smallest scale a little bit smaller. That looks good. And I'm going to darken the ground a little bit more. Bring up the fur length. Let's darken it. So here's a quick render. See, the barnacles are looking good. So using the same method, I just brought in another rock to put closer in the foreground, just to give it a little bit more depth. And those two have the barnacles growing everywhere. The barnacles, you could add as many as you possibly want. You could triple the amount. It would still look great. So let's go in and add an environment fog. We'll go to V-Ray environment fog, plug that in, and if you ever plug in the fog and it looks black, it's not that there's too little fog. It's usually the opposite. There's too much fog. So the first thing I always adjust is my fog density, and I'll go in there and just bring that down. You could see immediately you see more fog. So this always used to throw me off because I used to think the fog was broken because it was black, and it was actually so much fog that it was blocking out all the light. So we'll just bring this down. And we'll bring up the fog distance a little to push it further back. And the fog height, The default is 100, but I think this scene is a little bit bigger. So you can see it ties everything up, makes it all feel more uniform. It is very dark, but the shot is a very dark shot. I'm bringing in some seaweed that I got from Speedtree. So here you can see a photogrammetry piece of geo. On the Ningyo, we did our own photogrammetry using Autodesk Memento, which is now called Recap. But for this demo, I thought it'd be cool if you guys could just use the exact same mesh. So we just pulled one from Megascans. If you guys don't know Megascans, you should. They're absolutely amazing. And at first, we'll just keep this super simple. So we're just going to do the obvious stuff. We're just going to plug in our color maps, our gloss maps. We'll use, even at this point, I'll start blocking in how I want my lights to be, since I know that this asset is going to be used on one specific shot. So I want to make sure that I'm look deving it for that one shot. So I try to use as little light sources as possible. I always try to backlight, meaning the light being the furthest away from camera as possible, and usually behind the subject. Since there's going to be a wall behind our subject, I'm going to place the light from behind 3/4. And I'm just going to start dialing the gloss down. One of the tough things about this underwater sequence is the fact that underwater you lose your reflectivity and you lose your specular highlights, which is usually what makes something look cool or makes something look realistic. Once you strip all of that stuff out, you end up looking, your models will end up looking a little flat. So let's just go in and just populate our maps here. We'll plug in our gloss map, make sure spec or reflection maps, gloss maps, all of them are set to raw. And if they look incorrect to you or too bright or too dark, always use your exposure or your color gain. So your color gain will adjust your whites and your color offset would adjust your blacks. So we'll plug in the bump map that was included with this scan, and I was a little disappointed by it. It's an extremely high res map, but when I look at it, it just looks flat to me. And even when I crank it up, it just doesn't have the effect that I want. So in this version of V-Ray, there's a new texture called the V-Ray layer texture. It's an amazing tool. It's still early on. There's a few things I wish they would add to it, like the ability to name the individual layers. But for now, let's just create that, and we'll also create a fractal noise. And we'll increase the repetition so that the detail becomes much finer. That'll give it a bigger sense of scale. And I'll create the first layer, and I'll drag that into my texture slot. I'll create another layer, and I'll plug in my noise into that. I'll set it to multiply, and now if I look up close, I forgot to plug this into the bump, so let's plug that in. So we'll replace the old one, and immediately you see how there's much more complexity on that rock. And that's all I wanted, just more breakup. I'm already thinking about how the light is going to affect this, and I'll bring down the noise so that it doesn't overpower the custom map that was there. You also want to try to avoid something looking too procedural, but it's I use the procedurals as a way of adding more complexity to what's already there. You can see when I turn that off or on, it's a huge difference. One looks like a vinyl toy, and the other one has a tertiary level of detail that I want. Okay? So let's just take a look around. Looks okay for now. This is going to be so obscured by atmosphere that we don't have to be so precise on this. This is the boring part of the lecture, so bear with me. I want to be very organized with this, so name everything. That way, further down the pipeline, I'll be able to find whatever I need, including my noise textures and even the layered texture. You could rename these later. I believe I do so with this. So let's just name our new shader. It's going to be the sand. So I want to create a secondary shader just to scatter sand on the ledges of the rocks. I don't know how necessary this really was, only because the specularity underwater is so similar that I probably could have just pulled this off with just layer texture, but I wanted to show it anyway because I use this so often on stuff that's not underwater. So I'm just plugging in all the maps for the sand. And I'll just drag that on so you can see we have this really ugly mustardy color. And we'll go into our hypershade and replace the 2D placement node and just use a single 2D placement node on every other map that we're going to populate inside of the shader. Since they're all tileable textures here, by adjusting a single node, it'll propagate across our bump, our speck, our gloss, whatever. So you can see we're increasing the scale to 5, trying to see what the correct value is. So I'm really close up because sometimes it's hard to gauge the size unless you get really close. And we'll bring this up. I just want a very high frequency detail here. And we'll bring up the reflection a bit. Bring up the exposure just a little bit. So for our bump map, we'll just go in. We're not going to have to do a layered texture here. This is already a very noisy map to begin with. I'll actually end up using the normal map instead of the bump map that comes with the Megascan sand shader. Sorry, sand texture. And you can see the 2D placement node is not shared yet, so we'll just replace that. So again, they're all using the same repetition. I forgot to set the bump map to normal map, so let's go back in and swap that to map in tangent space. And let's just increase the repetition. And we'll bring up the bump amount. So let's jump to Mudbox for a bit. For those of you that haven't used it, it's an amazing tool. We pretty much, Tran and I, only use Mudbox for everything. You can see the layer systems work just like Photoshop. You have your file size, bit size, so 8-bit RGBA, TIFF. We'll select a diffuse map. We'll put OK. And you see we could turn it on and off just like Photoshop, lock it. We could lower our opacity, and we have resolution is always visible on the side. We also have the blending modes on the top right. So we'll turn off fall off based on facing angle, which is like edge masking in Mari. It will mask all the geometry that is at an angle higher than 45 degrees from the angle it's being painted on. So you could see as I very sloppily, if that's even a word, paint this down onto the geo, when I turn the geometry forward, when I rotate, you will see that it will not smear across the front face. It will only hit the top edges. So we'll just go in here and scatter this real quick. So the idea is just that through all the years, sand has fallen onto these ledges, and the rock will still be clearly visible, but we just want sand on the tops. So let's just keep going in and seeing what else we could do. And you could be sloppy with this. I mean, ultimately, it's how sand falls at the bottom of the ocean. Who really knows? We'll go in, we'll use the eraser tool and just clean up certain areas where the sand is painted on the forward-facing ledges. And again, we could be pretty sloppy with this. I still have my edge masking turned on. You don't have to when you're erasing, but I chose to just leave it on. So that looks pretty good. Let's create another layer. We will bring the layer beneath. We'll set the color to black, and we will go down to flood paint layer. So everything will be flooded to black. We'll right click, export channel merged, and we'll export this out as a cliff sand mask and save it as a TIFF file, 8-bit. There's no need for anything higher. And there you go. If we wanted to add another level of complexity, we could go in here and use the dry brush, which is like the cavity brush in ZBrush, and it'll just darken up the crevices. I don't necessarily need it for this, but I just wanted to show you how to get a little bit more complexity if you wanted it. Definitely didn't need it for this, but I just wanted to show so it doesn't feel so contrived or so perfectly clean. It'll just give it another layer of complexity. And since it's ultimately taking seconds to do, might as well just do it. So we're back inside of Maya. So let's grab a layered shader. Let's name this something else. We'll call this Cliff Rock. We'll open up a 2D texture and we'll load up that mask. So in the blend material, we'll throw the rock into the base material. And let's call this Cliff Master for now. Maybe we should call it Cliff Layered. And then we'll throw the sand onto coat material 0. Let's apply that shader onto the geo and see what that looks like. Now, it currently has the blend amount to 50%, and as I bring that down, you'll see the full rock. Give it a second. So there you go, there's the 100% rock. And as I bring the blend amount all the way forward, we'll see only the sand. Okay. So let's get that 2D texture, load up that mask. And plug it into the blend amount. So now you can see the sand is only on the masked areas. I don't like how saturated it is. I want to graph this. I'm going to bring down the bump a little bit. And I do want to go back in and adjust the saturation of the sand. It looks like there's mustard on top. So we'll tweak that. But you can see the effect is there. You're only getting the sand on the top. Now, if this was above surface and we had a strong specularity, we could have certain areas look much more matte and other areas look much glossier, which would give a really nice effect. But again, we have to work with these very flat surfaces in terms of the reflectivity, because we're working underwater. So let's graph this for a minute and let's bring down the saturation. So we'll go to our color map that is down here. We'll move some of these guys out of the way. We'll go to Remap HSV and we'll plug the color map into the remap, and then under saturation we'll just bring this ramp down. So if you bring that down to 0.6, you'll have 60% saturation. And then we have to plug that remap into the diffuse. So it'll go in there, desaturate it, and then reapply it as a color. So you could see that looks much better. We could also go into saturation and bring this all the way up so you could see how you could use this for all kinds of funky effects. Let's bring this back to what we had before, maybe a little bit higher, and you could see if we bring the value down, we could make it almost feel like it's mud or black tar. And we'll bring the value up just so it's a little bit brighter. Again, just to show, we'll leave it at 1, but we did leave the saturation down. So that looks pretty good. Let's just spin it around. Let's see how this looks. So let's go back into Mudbox and create this barnacle piece that we could scatter throughout our model. I created a super simple low poly mesh in Maya, and we're just using the standard brush, the standard sculpt brush, to add some detail here. It's pretty straightforward. Even if you've never used this program, you could do all this process in ZBrush, of course. So this is not exclusive, of course, to Mudbox. So here we have our high poly model. All the detail is put in. Of course, keep in mind that we're gonna, so this is our UVs here. We're gonna export a normal map. So we'll just go to UVs and maps, extract texture map, and we'll go to, first we'll name this operation in case we have to come back to it. And we'll select our level 0 as our low poly model, and level 5, which is our highest resolution, as our high. We'll set this to subdivision, not ray casting. Subdivision will give us a better accuracy. Ray casting is more, it's used more for games. We'll set the image size, we'll leave it at 1K for now. We'll set anti-aliasing to 2x. 8-bit is fine. We'll turn off preview as normal map, or else it'll appear in one of our layers as a bump map. So we'll export this out, save this out as a TIFF, and just press extract. So pretty simple. We'll select the model, step down to level 0, file, export selection, and we'll export out the model. Alright, so let's talk about a few things we need to know before we could jump into Nuke. First thing is we have to have a true understanding of what it means when we say an image is made of RGB. Now, we all know that, we always see it on our documents, but how do we use that to our advantage? So every image is made up of RGB, and each channel is no different than a layer mask. Whatever is black is removed, whatever is white is visible. However, every single one of those layers is only red, only green, and only blue. So when you look at your channels, all you're seeing are 3 colors with layer masks. Let me show you a better demo here. Let's create a new layer and make sure it's 100% red. And we know that by it being 255 and green and blue being 0. We'll create a layer mask right next to it, and we'll paste whatever we had in our red channel into that layer mask. Then we'll create a green solid layer. You can see 0 red, 0 blue. We'll flood it, create a layer mask, and then we'll paste in the green channel inside of that layer. We'll copy our blue channel, create a solid blue layer, making sure everything is 0 except for blue, which is 255. We'll create a layer mask, and we'll paste in our blue channel. Now we'll grab our original image and just turn it 100% black. So you could see just the red, just the green, just the blue. And when we start setting the blending modes to add, you can see there's no original image. It's 100% red, 100% green, 100% blue. When we see them all together with the layer masks, that's the only thing you'll see. So how can we use this to become better at color correction? Here I'm going to select a random color and just flood the layer with it. I'll create a second layer, do a marquee box, and select another random color. And I will flood it. Now normally when I wanted to color correct this, I would have to go into image adjustment, hue saturation, and start messing with these settings until they finally looked right. And that could take forever. The other problem is maybe you're more colorblind than you realize, and you might never hit that color. You're always kind of eyeballing it, and that's not an efficient way of doing this. So the proper way of doing this is we'll create a levels adjustment layer. Let's move it over to the side and expand the window. We're only going to use these bottommost sliders, but we only want it to affect that mustardy layer. Okay, so just this bottom sliders. So we'll link it just to that layer. Then we'll go into our red channel, which you can see will appear black and white, and we will set our levels to only affect the red. You can see I highlighted it red. Now we're only going to move that white slider to the left until it disappears, or until the box disappears. Then we'll go to green, select green in the levels drop down, do the same thing until the box disappears. It's gone. Go to blue. Now add white. We're only using those bottom 2 sliders. Once that's gone, if we go back to RGB, the color will match 100%. So you could be completely colorblind and still get perfect color correction. Alright, so let's grab everything and put it together. So if we look at this, we have our diver, we have background. Let's just remove the fog and just look at this. You can see it looks pretty terrible. There's nothing nice about this at all. But I wanted to show how we could grab these two elements and make something really nice inside of Nuke. Make this feel photographic. We'll start shuffling out our passes like we did on the sphere demo. So we'll start with lighting, GI. It's very little GI. You can see specular is almost non-existent. And we'll start merging these guys together. So I'm going to create two grade nodes. The first one will crank up the gain just a bit so we get more highlights. And the second one will bring down the gain drastically. So you can see the roto node is being plugged into the mask. And then I'm controlling the fall off by clicking on the points of the roto and control dragging them out. So you see we're darkening that again. And this one, we'll change it up a little bit. We'll make it darker from the top. And this will make more sense in a bit. We'll just give it a little bit of a shape. And the fall off. So again, we're just clicking those points and holding down Control and extending them. We'll set the feather fall off to smooth. Okay, so you can see if I turn that on and off, it looks extremely dark, but it'll all come together. Next thing is I'm going to add a glow node. And you can see when I do that, it's almost like it's blurring the image and then screening it or adding it back on top. So I'm going to go in there and I'm going to increase the size, which is almost like increasing the blur amounts. Okay. You can see the difference that it does. It really only blurs the brightest areas. But I'm going to turn on effect only so that I have to manually merge it back onto my chain. To just give me a little bit more control, I could just use the mix slider. And now I'm going to add another glow node, but I'm not going to connect it to the merge node I just created. I'm going to always connect the next glow node to the node before the first glow node. And I'll change the settings on this a bit. And what I'm trying to do with this, it'll make a little bit more sense in a bit, but just creating a murkiness. And this is a technique that I started developing during the Ningyo. We'll grab another glow node, paste it. Increase the size. And we'll set this to plus. So you can see how that's starting to look. Again, notice that the glows are all being connected to the node pre-first glow node. If we were to connect it to one of the merge nodes that already has a glow, it would be multiplying those glows. So we don't want that. You can see these glows are becoming, the size is becoming bigger and bigger. So let's do a copy of our original image, and I'm going to shuffle out the atmosphere pass. So you can see we have our atmosphere. And we'll just merge that back onto the background. Okay. So look what happens when I turn off the glows. It feels like it's in a room full of fog. It doesn't feel murky. So these glow nodes make a huge difference to that underwater feel. You do have to still use the fog, but this gives it another layer of realism, I feel. And I'm just going to organize my my mini glow nodes. And let's bring these guys back in. So you can see it looks darker on the right, which is what I wanted. So I'm going to create a constant, and I'm going to make it pretty big. Constant is just a solid color. And I'll create a radial node, and I'll squash it horizontally and place it all the way on the left. Bring it up just a little bit. We'll go to filter, volume raise, and you can see that there's the vol pos. That's essentially your light source, and it's going to use the luminance values to create this volumetric effect. So we're going to position this. Start playing with our ray length. see that stretches out. It's a little too God Ray-ish for me. So I'll do the pre-ray blur to soften those lines, make it feel less like the second coming of Jesus. And then I'll go in and play with the volume gamma and the volume gain. Okay. So grab a merge node, merge that onto that. So you could see there's a reason why I made that constant larger than the background image. I'm now going to grab a transform node and position it slightly off screen. So it feels like this light is coming right off the side. Just make it slightly blue. So that's looking better. So you can see the difference that makes. We're going to add more contrast and such later, so I'm not so worried about how washed out it looks at the moment. So just brought in this particle sequence that I created maybe 5 years ago. Before I show you what I'm going to do with it, though, if you look at this, the marching ants around my image, the reason why that's happening is because my bounding box has not been set. So you can see how there it says 3072 by 1729. You have to always set your bounding box to, in this case, it would be to B. What is in the B input, so that it's only processing the 2496 by 1249. There you can see that's all gone, and it'll speed up your render drastically. So you can see we have the particles here, and even if I lower the opacity, they just don't feel like they're lit in the same environment, nor should they, because they were not. But sometimes when you're using existing footage, even live action footage, you have to try to figure out how to get this stuff to feel like it belongs. So what do we do here? I'll show you a technique that I use often. I'll add a grade node. And you can see I'm doing it before I added the particles. And I'm going to crank up the black levels and bring down the white point to get a lot of contrast. I'll blur it. Maybe even higher than 100. And even though the colors look all wonky on it, don't look at the colors, just look at the brightness values, and you're going to see I'm going to plug in the mask input on the particles and set it to RGBA red. So now you can see the particles are only appearing in areas where it's extremely bright, and the opacity will fade away as it goes to screen right, making it feel like they're being lit by the same light source. The closer they get to the light source, the brighter the particles are. We'll bring the scale down slightly so that the particles appear a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit higher. That looks good. So let's add a mirror. So we'll grab those exact same particles and just mirror them over. You could select vertical or horizontal. We'll use the same mask and we'll set this to RGBA. So we'll set one to vertical flip. We'll set a time offset. You can see we have frames 0 to 191, so we can't offset it by too much. We have 140 frames. My original timeline starts at 350. So let's actually go in, and it's set to 350 on everything, so we should probably just set our entire project to start at 350. I think it's actually 360. To 500, so 150 frames. I think I actually changed that later into 360. So now we go to time offset, and we could offset that by a few frames, just so that all the particles are not doing the exact same thing. Let's merge that back on. Okay. And we'll add one more merge. And again, we'll add the same mask. Make sure we set it to RGB.red. Super important. By you setting it to RGB.red, it's gonna use the luminance values as opposed to the alpha channel. And now you can see I'm going in and setting the bounding box on everything to B. So it processes faster. And we'll do one more. So we're just lowering the mix amount. This guy, I'm not going to add a mask to it. I just want it to be a very subtle, evenly distributed particle. We'll just place it off to the side. We'll set that to B, bounding box, and that looks pretty good for now. So here I'm bringing in some particles that were rendered out. These were done in Houdini. If you don't use Houdini, though, you could do this in Maya if you wanted to. On the Ningyo, we actually had our friend do this, but I'll show you in a second how to do this in Maya if you want to just do it yourself. So I'll just add a soften node. I add soften nodes often. Takes the CG edge off a bit. For some reason the particles were being cut off, so I'll just move them up a bit. And that's actually exactly what I wanted. And I'll add a grade node. And set it to RGB alpha and just sample. So the gain is basically what you want to turn your white into. So I'll just sample one of the brightest points on the left just to make the bubbles have a little more blue in the white. So it's not a pure white anymore. You can see that already feels much better. So here we have another set of bigger bubbles. And these are the ones I'll show you how to do in Maya. These were created in Houdini though, but you could get the same effect in Maya. So I'm just going to shuffle out a few things here. For the A, we'll do a refraction, and for B, we'll do specular. I'll add a grade node to the specular and just bring up the multiply a bit so it'll have more highlights. And I can bring down the mix if I wanted to. That looks, and we'll add a soften node as well. I don't know why I kept two merge nodes here. It's definitely something I get rid of later. So you could see the merge node is going directly from the bubbles, and then there's another one going in after the glow node. I did not need both of those. But yeah, I will get rid of the first one later down the line. So if you're wondering why that's there, it's just a mistake on my part. We'll get rid of that later.